Welcome back. Well, today I have Orange County Sheriff with us, Sheriff Barnes, who's going to talk a little bit about protection, being safe, and a couple of numbers that are coming out of the jails. Well, Sheriff, thank you so much for joining us. It was very nice to have you here, even though it's not here.
Well, it's as close as we can be to here during this time. And we're trying to practice what we preach with social distancing, and we're doing a lot of these meetings via the internet.
Right.
And I'm fortunate to be back on your show. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us and taking the time. I know you've been very busy. So let's talk a little bit about overall safety. I mean, we have a community here of 55 and over who are nervous, not necessarily just for COVID-19 or catching the virus, but also for emergency purposes. I mean, they really would like to know sort of where you guys stand in helping the community.
Sure. Well, thanks for that question. And I can tell you where we stand in helping and assisting the community is we are doing exactly what we're doing before. We haven't stopped doing our job. We're doing it differently than we had previously. Before the COVID-19 crisis really hit Orange County, we got out a little bit ahead of it with some preemptive and preventative measures. And in doing that, we closed down a lot of our public counters. We stopped dealing first person with the public wherever we have to. Our dispatch, when we had calls for service and our deputies would normally go out and meet somebody face to face, we stopped doing that where we didn't have to do that anymore. Started taking calls, reports over the phone rather than in person and things like that. So we've been kind of out ahead of it. We also, through our dispatch, worked with them when people were calling for help to explain to them why we were changing our protocols and asking some preemptive questions like, is anybody in the household sick, have flu-like symptoms? Has anybody tested positive for COVID-19? So we could let them know. We also told them through our dispatchers that when deputies came out, we would probably try to maintain social distancing as best we could, meet them outside where possible, and all those other things. And the public's been overwhelmingly receptive and positive about some of the things that we put in place. Our calls for service have decreased significantly as a result, and they're down. And some categories of crime are down as well, and I'll cover some of those a little bit later. But for the most part, if you are still expecting to get service from the Sheriff's Department, you're still going to get those services, just maybe in a little different fashion than you would have before.
We had a discussion with the Orange County Fire Authority, and, you know, obviously they have to change their practices too. So I would imagine that you guys are having masks and gloves and things like that. But is that, I mean, the masks are different, but are the gloves really that much different if you were to be on scene somewhere?
No, we've always had some equipment for personal protective equipment for our deputy sheriffs, and routinely they would wear gloves. Not very frequently would they wear masks as a part of their normal routine. There would be environments where they might, if they were in a drug lab or something like that, they would don personal protective equipment to make sure that they are safe. In this environment, it's a little different. So we have different types of masks that they would wear. They have the full N95 mask that would be something they would use if they had come in contact with an individual who might be positive with COVID-19.
Right.
A lot of the masks that they're wearing are just the facial barrier mask, and wearing those as a precautionary measure. Sure. And even beyond that, all of our inmates in the jail right now have those facial barrier masks. So if they're going anywhere outside of their cell or their immediate housing environment, they would put those masks on. So we're hoping to protect them as much as protect our staff.
Well, you know, let's actually jump to that, because I know you have some numbers that you'd like to share with us regarding inmates. And I mean, there's been a lot of discussion across the country about how they are releasing inmates and, you know, how does that actually work? So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. But first, let's talk a little bit about some of the numbers that you were mentioning about inmates, you know, having COVID-19 or not.
So yes, we have, again, we got out ahead of this and changed some of our protocols within our custody operations, our jails. We stopped visiting, for example. We stopped a lot of the programs from outside the organization to come in and volunteer or pay programs. So we stopped as much as possible the in and out of people coming in and out of the jails. Right. Our jails don't have face-to-face visits in most of our jail circumstances, but what I was concerned about is on visiting days, we will have hundreds of people in a very large mass setting that would place them at risk. And so as difficult as that was, we stopped our visiting for the protection of our staff working there and also those who come to the facilities who might unknowingly have COVID-19 or be around somebody who might have it and transfer it that way. So we try to play by the same rules that we expect everybody else to in regards to mass gatherings and social distancing. We have about 4 weeks ago, it was actually March 19th, we had, the week after that, we had our first inmate who is positive with COVID-19. We have different types of housing environments within the jail. We have single cells and we have dormitories and we have large barracks types settings that have hundreds of inmates in an open environment. And fortunately, that one environment was a 68-man dormitory style housing. So not only was that first person that we gathered, then we had to deal with quarantining all the rest of the inmates who that person was living with. And we had protocols in place. And we follow the same protocols that are based on CDC guidelines. So I'll use two terms that people may not fully understand, which is isolation, medical isolation, and quarantine. So once we had that first inmate, we put him in medical isolation in a cell by himself. And then we quarantined all the rest of those inmates who were housed with him. And quarantine means you separate them from the jail population. They're not symptomatic or asymptomatic. They don't have flu-like symptoms, but you don't want to mix them with everybody else in case somebody does have COVID-19. And when that happens, we would separate them out. Up to that point, we had about 15 or 16 inmates that had flu-like symptoms, which are the symptoms consistent with COVID-19 that we are medically isolating and watching. And all those were tested, and we had all those came back negative until that one individual. And since then, we've had 17 inmates test positive. 5 have fully recovered, which means they have recovered and gone back into the main population with the jail. We have 29 people tested negative, which is a good thing. So everyone got tested, and we have, I think, 4 that are pending test results, and we should have those back within the next day or so. Currently, we have 28 medical isolation. That would be for flu-like symptoms. And we have 455 inmates who are being quarantined. And that sounds like a large number. But what we started doing about a week or 10 days ago is every new booking coming into the jail, a new arrested person or somebody coming to our facility, we would quarantine for 7 days as a precautionary measure. So we would isolate those people out. They still have all the privileges every other inmate would have, but we would isolate them out so that they wouldn't, if they brought something from outside, it would hopefully manifest. We'd recognize it before they were spread it amongst the rest of the jail. I did have, it is working well. I think we're on it. We're still in not community transference like we're seeing in the general community. We're still trying to contain it, and I think we've done a good job of containing it to these one areas. I did have 3 deputy sheriffs who were exposed and contracted COVID-19. 2 of them have fully recovered, and the last one we're anticipating will recover fully as well, relatively soon. The other thing that I think is really for the public to know is all these inmates who have contracted COVID-19 are all being treated within the jail. None of them have gotten severe enough where they need to be transferred to a hospital.
That's good.
And that's important. You did mention about the releases, and if I can just explain what that means to, I think, your viewers. So going back to where we were a few weeks ago, about a month ago, we had our population was already down a little bit. So we had some capacity to move inmates around and keep them safe. Since the beginning of March, our population was about 5,300 inmates. It's one of the largest jails in the nation. And we've decreased that now to below 3,200. So it's about a 40% decrease in our jail population within just over a month. And we did that by several means. First, I had in the government code the authority in an emergency to release inmates. In fact, the language is very broad. It says that I can release any inmate. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to release those who present the least risk to the public. And then when I made the decision in about March 20th to start releasing inmates, we defined those as least risk for those who were already sentenced to nonviolent, non-serious offenses. So these were inmates who were already coming up on their release date. We just released them a little bit earlier. And we started with 10 days. We eventually went to 30 days early. And we've released about 400 inmates early using that mechanism. We also identified through the healthcare agency those inmates who I have in my care who they have identified as being medically at risk. That could be either by age or pre-existing medical condition.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who met the same criteria, sentence coming up on the end of their sentences, we went 60 days early for those who are medically at risk. And that is included in about the 400.
Okay.
The other, we also release people through attrition. And what that means is, people probably don't realize this, but most of the inmates who come to my jail aren't new arrests that come from the community or the municipal police agencies or the sheriff's department. Mm-hmm. They get remanded to my custody from the courts. Well, the courts have closed down temporarily, which means those inmates who are appearing in court aren't getting remanded to my custody, which allows us to bring the population down even more. And the courts are working through a collaborative group to start releasing inmates as well. So we are working with them, the public defender, the district attorney, and they've released about 100 or so using that mechanism. So all that adds up to that decrease. And when you have a 40% less population, it allows us the ability to better manage our jail population, create social distancing in barracks and dormitory environments, and also isolate them appropriately if they are at risk or exposed.
Well, and we also understand that the whole overall crime rate is down across the country. So that has to obviously contribute to your numbers because you're not getting as many people, right?
Well, that is true. So crimes like property crimes are down. A lot of the crimes that we normally see, traffic collisions are down. What we are noticing is that when traffic collisions do occur, they're actually much more severe because people are driving faster. So just because we're still doing our job and we're still out patrolling our neighborhoods, and you will still get a ticket for speeding. Mm-hmm. So we ask people to still abide by all the law. Initially, I should say, we didn't see any increases in some categories that I was concerned about, that being domestic violence, child abuse, and even elder abuse. And the last 10 days, 2 weeks or so, we have seen a market uptick in those two categories. Okay. Domestic violence cases, at least calls for service to the sheriff's department, have increased 25%. And family disputes have increased 24%. And child abuse has increased as well. Though the numbers are normally low, but it's still increased from 3 to 8 in the same time frame. So people, stay-at-home orders are great. We need you to stay at home for the benefit of the community and for first responders and medical staff. Right. But that creates opportunities for some of those crimes to increase as well, which we're concerned about.
Well, unfortunately, because the kids are home and they're home all the time, and then you've got parents working all the time in all the same areas. So I imagine that would be very difficult. Let's talk a little bit about elder abuse, because that's something we should be concerned about here in our community.
Sure. So that is one area where we're concerned. We're going to be filming a PSA later this afternoon to put out. Okay. Be checking on each other as we do. We can do things like we're doing right now, either Skype or FaceTime, whatever that might be. But we need to check up on each other, even if it's just making sure. And if there are conditions or an environment where we think somebody may be abused, we want you to report that. We will still investigate those cases as is necessary. So whenever those things do occur, we want to make sure. But predominantly in a great community like Laguna Woods, there's probably not a better time than to get to know your neighbor than right now from a distance. Right. So if you don't know your neighbors well, please associate yourselves with them, check up on each other, and make sure that all their needs are being met. And you can do that in a safe way through either dropping off groceries, having things delivered, or just checking up on one another to make sure that you are all okay.
Exactly. And we've been promoting that through various resources here. Memorial Care across the way has been providing us delivery service. Many churches, organizations really have come together. So I think that's one thing we can certainly say about the communities is they really are pulling together to help everyone.
Well, this is the time. It's an awkward environment to be in when you think the time we need community the most is when you can't be communal and be together. But a lot of people are adjusting well, and I think that we will get through this. My hope is we'll get through this sooner than later. And I think you can see light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly. Well, I do appreciate you taking the time. I know you're very busy, and it's very nice to hear that you're all still doing the same things that you normally do in light of what we're dealing with.
Well, thank you very much.
All right. You have a great day.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this.